Hey everyone, this first lecture is on prehistory, which I call that because it's before we've recorded history. So this really starts with the Paleolithic culture and the sudden explosion of their monumental art, which marks the most significant beginning to the history of art and design. We're going to start with a quick look at the caves of Lascaux and Chevet. So, a virtual revolution occurs in the creation of art during the Upper Paleolithic period of Europe. It begins around 40,000 BCE, which stands for Before Common Era. Archaeological record shows that anatomically modern humans effectively replaced Neanderthals and remained the sole hominid inhabitants across continental Europe. At about the same time, and directly linked to this development, the earliest art was created. So, in the painted caves of Western Europe, namely in France and Spain, we witness the earliest evidence of the human capacity to interpret and give meaning to our surroundings. Building. Through these early achievements in representation and abstraction, we see a newfound mastery of the environment and a revolutionary accomplishment in the intellectual development of humankind. The painted walls of the interconnected series of caves in Lascaux in southwestern France are among the most impressive and well-known artistic creations of Paleolithic humans. Although there is one human image, most of the paintings depict animals found in the surrounding landscape, such as horses, bison, mammoths, ibex, aurochs, deer, lions, bears, and wolves. These are animals that would have been hunted and eaten, such as deer and bison, as well as those that were feared predators, such as lions, bears, and wolves. At Lascaux, the purpose of portraying animals remains a little obscure. Most of the paintings are located at a great distance from the cave's entrance, and many of the chambers are not easily accessible. This placement, along with the enormous size and compelling grandeur of the paintings, you can see in the image beside me how small that person standing is there next to these gigantic murals on the walls. It suggests that the remote chambers may have served as sacred or ceremonial meeting places. In addition to the painted images, Lascaux is rich with engravings of animals as well as abstract designs. In the absence of natural light, these works could only have been created with the aid of torches and stone lamps filled with animal fat. How do you think they made their artwork? They weren't able to go to halls and get paintbrushes and paint. So the pigments used to paint Lascaux and other caves were derived from readily available minerals and include red, yellow, black, brown, and violet. No brushes have been found, so in all probability, the broad black outlines were applied using like mats of moss or hair, or even with raw chunks of the color itself. The surfaces appeared to have been covered by paint blown directly from the mouth through a tube. Color-stained, hollowed-out bones have been found in the caves, giving evidence for this. As your book discussed with cave paintings, it's unlikely that many people, other than those in particularly harsh climates, took up residence in caves. So caveman is a bit of a misnomer. Paleolithic people were nomadic, which means they moved from place to place to follow their food, animal migrations, and vegetation cycles. For this reason, the structures they built for protection were easily assembled and disassembled and made with readily available materials, so they were portable, mobile, and light. A first example here is a wigwam. It uses tree branches tied together at the top and weaving more flexible twigs and branches through that main structure. It may even receive an exterior plastering with mud, or in the case of the one that you're looking at here in the image, tree bark. Another form you're probably familiar with is a teepee. It's essentially a wigwam covered with skins instead of grasses and tree bark. On the American plains, the native people built round, portable structures with a frame of wooden poles and a covering of skin. Its interior was simply the inside of its structure without adding treatment or furniture. An igloo was used in the cold months by the Inuit people of the Arctic region. It's a structure built up of blocks of snow in a dome-like form. An entrance tunnel of snow blocks is angled to block the prevailing winds so the interior is more protected, and they often included a space to accommodate their dogs. A yurt is used by the people of Mongolia. It's a portable structure that uses a vertical wall frame or lattice strips that collapse for transport, but are expanded and tied to form a circle. Willow strips are used to create a roof structure, and layers of felt are applied to form the wall and roof enclosure. Tools in this era were invented and refined more for hunting than building. The invention of the spear, which later became the bow and arrow, made hunting considerably easier, whereas before it was a major group effort. Harpoons and fish hooks made of bone also increased the catching of fish. So there's many other types of structures that happen in many, many different cultures, but they all have some very strong similarities to some of the more familiar ones that I've just shown you. There's a significant change in the living patterns that occur then between the Paleolithic time period and the Neolithic age, and it's due to a shift from hunting animals and gathering plants for sustenance to producing food by systematic agriculture. The planting of grains and vegetables provides a regular food supply. They tame animals such as sheep, goats, cattle, and pigs, which adds a steady source of meat, milk, and fibers, such as wool, for clothing. Once people settled in villages, they built houses for protection that were more permanent and other structures for the storage of goods. People also began to specialize in certain crafts, and a division of labor occurred. Men assumed the primary responsibility for working in the fields and herding animals, jobs that often kept them away from the home. Women often remained behind, caring for children and weaving clothes. Another advancement in crafts and tools was pottery, made from clay and baked in a fire to make it hard, used for cooking or to store grains. Woven baskets were also used for storage, and stone tools became refined as flint blades were used to make sickles and hoes for farming. This agricultural revolution gave humans greater control over their environment and enabled them to give up this nomadic way of life to begin living in settled communities. Traditionally, the various settlements established in the Near East, Africa, Middle Americas, and the Fertile Crescent are discussed in terms of these Neolithic settlements. I'm actually going to show you a very different example that comes much later in history than those locations, but it's here in America where you can more easily visit it and see it for yourself. The Anasazi tribe, or ancestral Puebloans, made Mesa Verde, which you're looking at in the slide, their home from about 550 to 1300 CE, which means Common Era. For more than 700 years, they and their descendants lived and flourished here. Sometime during the late 1190s, after primarily living on the Mesa top for 600 years, many ancestral Puebloans began living in pueblos they built beneath the overhanging cliffs. The structures ranged in size from one-room storage units to villages of more than 150 rooms. While still farming the mesa tops, they continued to reside in the alcoves, repairing, remodeling, and constructing new rooms for nearly a century. By the late 1270s, the population began migrating south into present-day New Mexico and Arizona. By about 1300, the ancestral Puebloan occupation of Mesa Verde ended. On June 29, 1906, President Theodore Roosevelt established Mesa Verde National Park to preserve the works of man. It was actually the first national park of its kind. All of our other national parks were given to wildlife preserves. Mesa Verde is in the southwestmost corner of Colorado, really close to Durango. So I lived in Colorado for a number of years and had an opportunity to visit Mesa Verde. And I'm going to show you a number of images from my visit there. So these are the ruins of the Anasazi village called Cliff Palace, which is part of the Mesa Verde complex. It's built into the side of the Mesa Cliff. You have a picture of this in your book that gives you a much better view, but I wanted to show you my vantage point actually walking in. And if you looked above that area, you'd see the mesa top where they farmed. Today, we actually enter the cliff dwellings by ladders, but the Anasazi would have been really amazing rock climbers. They climbed the cliffs using hand and toe holds. And the guides actually say that if you started off on the wrong foot, you would fall to your death. So they had the hand and footholds placed exactly right, that they just would be out of reach if you started on the wrong foot. There's also a small tunnel that you have to then crawl through to enter, which you're looking at in the picture on the right-hand side. It's really tiny. The guides say that there would be a guard standing at the other end to chop your head off if you were an intruder and not somebody who was supposed to be coming through. So there's like two really strong pieces of evidence of security measures that give a lot of rise to the theory that the reason the Anasazi moved from the plains and to the top of the Mesa Cliff and then even more protected below the cliff overhangs was probably for protection against some rival tribes. So let's take a look at some of the structures that they built. Some of them are actually even multiple stories. So you'll see evidence of something called a viga, which if you see the rows of heavy timber rafters, those are actually the indicators of divisions between levels in the building. So those would have held up the next level of the building or the roof. And this translates to present day architecture, where we actually see vigas, or at least not maybe structural, but the decorative look of them. It's really typical in a design motif of modern southwestern architecture, and it comes from their building practices. So they also built down into the ground to make kivas. This is still within the overhang of the cliff, but they might actually dig down in to create what they call kivas. Kiva is a Hopi word for ceremonial room. So the kiva at Mesa Verde were underground chambers that may be compared to like churches of later times or something like that. Based upon modern Pueblo practices, ancestral Puebloans may have used these rooms to conduct healing rites or to pray for rain, luck in hunting, or good crops. Kivas also serve as gathering places, and sometimes just as a place to weave. So a roof of beams and mud covered each kiva, supported by small columns throughout. Access was by a ladder through a hole in the center of the roof. The small hole that you're seeing in the floor is called a sipapu. It's the symbolic entrance to the underworld. Don't get that confused with the larger hole that you're seeing there, which is actually for a fire pit. But these below ground chambers would have been a really nice place in the desert climate, using the earth for thermal comfort. Warmer in the cold desert nights as the earth radiates the warmth absorbed by the sun during the day, and cooler in the hot desert days with the earth to protect from the harsh sun beating down. There's a lot of other cultures, especially in desert climates around the world that your book talks about, that also built underground. And here, just as a last quick pick, this is just an image to show you how close to the cliff edge they were living. It's truly an amazing place to visit and absolutely astonishing that these structures are still standing, no doubt thanks to their national park protection. Another example of some of the kinds of things that we're talking about that is right here in America, again, much later in date, but something that you could actually go see. So it is similar to what we're seeing in the Paleolithic age in Europe. But in our country near Moab, Utah, east of Canyonlands National Park, if you've ever heard of it, there are hundreds of ancient Native American petroglyphs, which means rock carvings. This one is actually called newspaper rock. So the first carvings at newspaper rock were made around 2,000 years ago. They were left by people from the archaic Anasazi, Fremont, Navajo, Anglo, and Pueblo cultures. The dark coating on the rock is called desert varnish, and it presented an opportunity for creativity. The ancient artists produced the many types of figures and patterns by carefully packing the coated rock surfaces with pecking the coated rock surfaces with sharpened stone tools to remove the desert varnish and expose the lighter rock underneath. In the Navajo, the rock is called Tizihon, which translates to a rock that tells a story. The Hopi refer to it as Tutavene, which means newspaper rock. The site was used by the Hopi, where ceremonial pilgrimages were made by young Hopi men to mark their passage into adulthood. They would stop and camp at the site and would peck their clan symbols into the rocks, showing their participation and passage in that pilgrimage. People from the same clan making the same pilgrimage to Tutaveni would put their symbols next to the symbols the previous Hopi pilgrims had made. This was a tradition that was carried on for 4 to 5 centuries by the Hopi. The site, while recognized as a Hopi traditional cultural property, is actually on land that's now owned by the Navajo, which was the result of a decades-old dispute that saw these neighboring tribes fighting over land who each considered it their own. The conflict was finally resolved in 2006, with much of the disputed 1.5 million acres going to the Navajo. Here's just a closer look at a few of the carvings. I love the one with the guy that has like these huge squiggles coming out of his head. And there's a lot of footprints, which makes sense because it was a pilgrimage. It was a place to mark your pilgrimage on the rock. Some of them actually remind me of how if ever in like a steamed up window, use the base of your hand to get something that kind of looks like a baby foot imprint and then use the pads of your thumb and fingers to put toes on it. You see a lot of those. But again, it's mostly representations of animals as well that maybe they encountered along the way. So, as we have seen, early humans formed small groups that developed a simple culture that enabled them to survive. As human societies grew and developed greater complexity, a new form of human existence, called civilization, comes into being. Many texts identify 3 key elements to defining civilization: an urban focus, a distinct religious structure, and political and military structures. But I think all of these early examples of human activity that I've been showing you here and your book shows you, such as those cave paintings that Lascaux discovered in 1940, it really begs to redefine the question of what constitutes civilized. So, circling back to late Neolithic Europe, we see the beginning of building megalithic structures. Megalith is Greek for large stone. Mega means large, lith meaning stone. Radiocarbon dating shows that the first megalithic structures were built around 4000 BCE, more than 1,000 years before the Great Pyramids were built in Egypt. So this first thrust of organized building was done by people using tools such as deer antlers and stone to excavate ground and impressive coordination of workers. The megalith structures were constructed as what's called dolmen or barrow. A dolmen consists of 2 or more upright stones supporting a large, flat, horizontal capstone called a lintel. Dolmens were often covered with earth or covered with smaller stones, which is actually what makes it be called a barrow. In most cases, that covering has weathered away, so we don't see that anymore, leaving only the sort of stone skeleton of the dolmen intact. So the purpose of these structures is believed to be tombs or burial grounds in most cases. Between 3200 and 1500 BCE, standing stones that were placed in circles or lined up in rows were erected throughout the British Isles and northwestern France. Some archaeologists have demonstrated the stone circles were used as observatories to detect not only simple astronomical phenomenon, such as the midwinter and midsummer sunrises, but also sophisticated observations such as the major and minor standstills of the moon. By far the most famous, and you probably recognize this image in the slide, is Stonehenge in England. Stonehenge consists of a series of concentric rings of standing stones similar to dolmen and barrow construction. The 80 bluestones weigh 4 tons each and were transported to the site on the plains of Salisbury from their original source 135 miles away in the mountains of Wales. The huge stones were carefully placed to create interior spaces with a strong aesthetic impact, whether they were originally open to the sky as we see them now, or roofed with materials that have since disappeared. Many hypothesize that the purpose of Stonehenge seems to have been connected with the rituals relating to the movements of the sun, moon, and stars. Each year, on the 21st of June, visitors from around the world gather at Stonehenge overnight to mark the summer solstice and to see the sunrise above the stones. At dawn, the central altar stone aligns with the slaughter stone, heel stone, and the rising sun to the northeast. So, before anything else, before we can use structures or enjoy them, we need the things we build simply to be strong and to hold fast. Stonehenge has stood for over 3 to 4 thousand years, so I'd say they did a pretty amazing job. From the time prehistoric people first cobbled together a shelter from sticks or piled one stone on top of another, humans have confronted that problem with varying degrees of success. And with the passing of centuries, as civilizations unfolded around the world and building became one of their paramount pursuits, the things people were willing to attempt became ever more ambitious. Great buildings, as well as the elements of what we now call civil engineering, like roads and bridges, aqueducts and dams, they were meant to speak of a civilization's power and mastery, and they became essential markers of a great culture. And accordingly, they became ever grander in design and scope and ever more challenging to construct. So that's what we're going to be studying this semester. And how. How did they become? How became one of the essential questions of history. How exactly do you transport the immense megaliths of Stonehenge, 135 miles from the mountains of Wales to the plains of Salisbury, and then somehow prop them up vertically and lay a lintel stone just as large and heavy across them? For your first media response, you're going to watch a video of a researcher that takes a stab at answering this question. I'll see you next time. Bye bye.